It had been a long day at work, and I was exhausted. I was working security at the time, and although it can be a really easy job, I was often really tired by the end of a shift. Maybe it was the boredom. The only thing on my mind was going home and getting some rest. But as I drove past the Burger King on my way back, the hunger pangs in my stomach reminded me that I hadn't eaten in a long time. I had just been crushing coffees instead. I decided to stop at the drive-thru and get some food. As I placed my order, I realized that the dining area was closed, so I had to eat in my car. I definitely couldn't wait until I got home. After I got my food, I pulled into an empty parking space and turned off my engine. It was dark and quiet. There were 2 other cars in the lot. I assumed they must have belonged to the workers at the Burger King. As I unwrapped my burger and took a bite, I heard some rustling outside my window. I was in the far corner of the parking lot, and there were some decorative bushes next to me that separated the lot from a small park. I looked up and saw a group of men approaching my car. They were all wearing hoodies and had their faces covered with surgical masks. The pandemic had started winding down at the time, so it was not that common to see people wearing masks outdoors. I quickly locked my doors and rolled up my windows, hoping they would go away, but they didn't. They surrounded my car. I think there were at least 5 of them. 2 stood behind my car blocking me from leaving, while another approached the driver's side window. He lightly tapped on the glass. I felt trapped and helpless, and I knew I had to act fast if I wanted to get out of that situation. I remembered that I had a can of pepper spray in my glove compartment. I quickly grabbed it and clutched it in my right hand. One of the men tapped on my window again, but this time, when I looked, he was holding a gun in front of me. He wasn't pointing it at me, just showing it. I guess he was trying to intimidate me into opening the door. If that's what he wanted, then it had the opposite effect. There was no way I was opening the door now. I put the car in reverse. 2 of the men were still standing behind me. I looked back and started moving slowly in reverse. I could see in my peripheral vision that the man at my window started to point the gun at me and shouted. I was startled by that and slammed my foot on the gas. The 2 men behind me jumped out of the way. They were a split second from getting run over. I was shaking as I drove back home. I couldn't believe what just happened to me. It was a wake-up call, reminding me that anything can happen, at any time. When I got home, I realized that I was lucky to have escaped unharmed. I called the police and told them what happened. As of right now, I've not heard an update on the case. The men were wearing masks, so I don't really know if they can find them. We'll see though. The police can be pretty clever. I still go to that Burger King from time to time, but now I always make sure to check my surroundings. I don't want to be caught off guard again. My name's Kyle, and I was a busboy at a restaurant when I was in high school. It was a busy place, especially on weekends. I had been working there for a few months at the time, and I got along really well with most of my coworkers. We all worked hard together, and formed a strong bond because of that. One of my coworkers was Vince. He was a dishwasher, and we would often joke around during our shifts, making the long hours go by quicker. One day, we were in the back messing around as usual. There was a big window with 4 or 5 metal shelves where the dishwashers would place the clean dishes. That's where I would grab clean plates to set the tables. Vince was on the other side. We would often joke around whenever I stopped by. One time I said something that I thought was harmless, but Vince took offense to it. I think it was just something like F off in a friendly sort of joking way. He snapped out of nowhere and tried to grab me through those shelves. He got a hold of my arm and tried to pull me in. I was able to squirm free, but I was really confused and scared. I had a hard time believing that he was serious. We didn't know each other that well, but I thought he could take a joke a little better than that. The next day at work, Vince was still acting strange around me. He was avoiding me, and when we did have to work together, he was short and wouldn't engage in any conversation. I didn't know what to do, and it was really making me feel uncomfortable. Then another of my coworkers, Jeff, came up to me. Jeff was an assistant chef, so he worked in the kitchen with Vince. Jeff told me that Vince had been ranting all night to anyone who would listen. He told me that Vince wanted to kill me. I'm sure he didn't mean that literally, but still. I avoided Vince as much as possible for the rest of the night and went home. That night, I got a call from an unknown number. I answered it, and it was Vince. He was furious. He started yelling at me, telling me that I disrespected him and I needed to watch my back. I was taken aback by the sudden anger. I tried to calm him down and apologize again, but he hung up on me. Over the next few days, things escalated. I got a WhatsApp message from Vince. He sent a picture of my house at night, and it looked recent. That really creeped me out because I didn't even think he knew where I lived. I started to avoid going out in public because I was afraid he would show up and start something. One day I was at school, and Vince showed up with a group of his friends. He went to a different school on the other side of town, so it would have been a real hassle for him to come to my school. I guess they must have ditched class that day. I was over at the mall for lunch, and I could see the gang of them standing around outside. When I was ready to go back, I managed to get back to the school before they saw me. Once I was inside, they didn't follow. I guess because they were too scared of getting in trouble for trespassing. Now that I think about it, they were probably just trying to intimidate me, and it worked. It was getting out of hand, and I knew I had to do something about it. I talked to my boss, and he said he would take care of it. He talked to Vince, and told him he couldn't continue to harass me, and that if he did, he would be fired. I was relieved that something was finally being done, but I was still scared that Vince would come after me. Thankfully, after the warning from our boss, Vince backed off. He was fired shortly after for unrelated reasons, and I was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. I didn't have to look over my shoulder anymore, or worry about getting into a fight at work. Now I work at a different restaurant. I still think about that experience from time to time. It was a difficult time in my life, and I'm glad it's over now. I'm still really confused why he was so sensitive. I'm pretty sure that he said some stuff to me that was at least as offensive. Some people can give it, but can't take it. About 5 years ago, I got a job at a pizza place near my house. It was supposed to be a part-time job to help me pay some expenses while I finished high school. Little did I know that it would change my life in ways that I never thought possible. My name's Andrea, and I was a high school student at the time. I had always been a hard-working student, and I took my studies really seriously. However, when I got a job at the pizza place, my grades started slipping. It wasn't the job that was the problem. It was one of my coworkers, Andy. Andy was always giving me the creeps. He would stare at me in a way that made me feel really uncomfortable, and he would make inappropriate comments. At first I tried to ignore him, but as time went on, I found it increasingly difficult to be around him. One day, I decided that enough was enough, and I quit my job. I was relieved to get away from him, and to be able to focus on my studies again. However, that relief would be short-lived. About a month after I quit, I started seeing Andy hanging around my school. I would see him way too much, and I felt like he was following me. Andy was at least 30 years old, so it was really strange to see him hanging around a high school. At first I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, but it kept happening. One night I was in bed reading, and I heard a noise coming from outside my bedroom window. My bedroom was on the ground floor, but my window was relatively high off the ground. A person could reach it if they stood on a box or a chair or something, so it freaked me out a little bit. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then it happened again. I got out of bed and walked to the window. I opened my curtains, and that's when I saw him. Andy was standing outside, staring into my window. I knew that I needed to call the police, but I was afraid he would break into my room before they arrived. I didn't know what he was capable of, and that scared me even more. I ran to my parents' room, and my dad called the police. When they got there, they found Andy lurking around outside my window, just as I described. They arrested him and took him away. The next few weeks were a blur. I was terrified to be alone, and I felt Andy was always watching me. I didn't want to go to school, and I didn't want to leave my house. Not that I felt safe there either. One day, I was walking home from school when I saw him again. Andy was standing across the street staring at me. I felt a lump form in my throat, and I started to panic. I sped up my pace, trying to pretend I didn't see him, but when I looked back, I could see that he was following me. Eventually, he was really close behind me, and I knew I couldn't get away. I stopped and turned around. I was about to start yelling at him when he said,
"I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. I just wanted to talk to you."
I didn't believe him. I knew he was lying, and I knew that he was dangerous. I started to back away, but then he grabbed my arm.
"Please,"
he said.
"I just want to talk to you."
I tried to pull away, but he was too strong. I screamed for help, but I wasn't sure if anyone heard me. I knew I was in trouble. Suddenly, I heard a voice, a man's voice, and it was coming from behind me. "Let her go," the voice said. I turned my head, and to my relief, it was my friend's older brother, Jackson. He had heard my screams and came to my rescue. Andy let go of my arm and started to run, but Jackson called the police. Andy was arrested again, and this time, he was charged with assault. Years have passed since this happened, but I still think about it sometimes. It was months afterwards that I started to feel normal again. I slowly began to feel safe like before. Fortunately, I never saw Andy again. I later found out that he was fired from his job at the pizza place. I'm not sure if it was because of his arrest, but that would make sense. It wouldn't surprise me if he did something else. I may never know, and to be honest, I don't really care. I just hope I don't see him again. This happened in September of 2022. I live in Birmingham in the UK. On this day, I was with my dad and sister at an arcade. We had just played some games of pool, and we were now at a buffet restaurant that was inside the arcade. We got seated at a table downstairs in this restaurant. I was familiar with the restaurant because I'd been there many times before. Me and my sister needed to use the bathroom, so I took her upstairs, which is where the bathrooms were. We entered and continued into separate stalls. I was taking a while, so my sister was waiting for me outside. There were loud fans, so I wouldn't have been able to hear her calling me to hurry up. But just then, I heard an unknown woman's voice saying something that I couldn't make out. I got slightly concerned, because my sister was all alone waiting out there. I finished up, and then I left the stall and saw something completely random. There was a woman speaking with my sister. She was asking her questions such as, "Where do you live? What do your parents do for work?" and others. I was extremely concerned, and I could see that my sister was panicking. I made up some lie about what our parents did, then I ended the conversation ASAP. We then walked out of those bathrooms. I did not say a word to our dad about what happened. After we left the restaurant, I went to my cousin's house. I told her about the whole thing, and she said that we may have just avoided human trafficking or something of the sort. I honestly don't feel safe going there anymore, and I will avoid it at all costs. I'm just glad I came out of that bathroom when I did, because God only knows what could have happened to my sister if I didn't. This is a scary story that happened years ago. I was hungry and craving a burger, so I decided to go to McDonald's. I had just gotten home from a night out, and it was past midnight, so I knew the restaurant would be nearly empty. Little did I know that it would turn out to be one of the scariest nights of my life. When I walked through the parking lot, I saw that there were only 2 cars there. I walked into the restaurant, and when I pushed the doors open, I was hit with a wave of cold air. The air conditioning was on full blast, and I immediately regretted not bringing a jacket. The place was almost completely empty, except for a few people scattered around. I could see a man in a hoodie sitting in a booth, a couple of teenagers at a table, and a lone worker behind the counter. As I walked up to the counter, I noticed that the worker looked tense. She was young, with blonde hair tied up in a messy bun. She had a name tag, and it read Emily. I could see the sweat beading on her forehead. She kept glancing around at the entrance. I could feel that something was off, and my gut told me to leave, but my hunger got the better of me. I ordered a burger and fries, and waited for my food. While I was waiting, I noticed that Emily kept checking her phone, and she looked more and more nervous with every passing second. Suddenly, one of the customers, the guy in the hoodie, stood up and walked to the counter. By then, there was another worker there, a man who seemed to be the manager. He was around 5'5" and overweight. The man in the hoodie started arguing with him. I was still standing there waiting for my order. I tried not to pay attention to them, but it was impossible to ignore. The man in the hoodie was screaming nonsense at the manager, and the manager tried to calm him down, but there was no use. Emily stood behind her coworker looking scared. None of us knew what to do. Suddenly, the man in the hoodie grabbed the manager by the shirt and jumped over the counter. When he did that, I noticed a knife in one of his hands. I stumbled back, not knowing what to do. When I finally got my bearings, I saw that Emily was already on the phone with the police. Luckily, there were 2 officers already in the area, and they must have arrived in less than 2 minutes. They were able to subdue the man, and when they pulled him off, I noticed a pool of blood on the ground, and it was growing. It was coming from the manager, who was still on the ground. An ambulance arrived in another minute, and the manager was taken away. I went home that night, but I was hardly able to sleep. I couldn't believe what happened. It all happened so fast. 1 minute, I was standing there waiting for my food, and in the next, I witnessed an attempted murder. I didn't find out exactly what happened to the man in the hoodie, but I imagine he was in big trouble. I returned to that McDonald's several months later, and I was relieved to see that that manager was still at work. Much respect to that guy for being able to recover, both physically and mentally, from what happened to him. When I saw him, I wanted to ask him how he was doing, but I thought it might not be a good idea to bring up the incident. I gave him a subtle nod, and he nodded back.